Human morality. What is it? Where does it come from? Many people think that morality is a direct byproduct of philosophical reasoning as we seek to discover either objective moral laws or negotiate subjective moral norms. Although I would not deny that reason plays a truly useful role in moral development, I see that role as an after-the-fact dynamic. Furthermore, it seems obvious to me that reason does not make anyone moral. It can help us achieve coherence with our moral code, but it can also help us justify our hypocrisy. So I'm not a fan of many of the arguments offered in the branch of philosophy called metaethics, or the controversy between objectivism and relativism. I found it amusing when a 2009 study found that library books on ethics borrowed by ethics professors and their students were 50% more likely to be returned late or not at all. So, what causes human beings to adopt moral standards and actually live by them, if not reason? As I understand it, it is an innate set of biologically based psychological drives and needs that are simply part of human nature. Human morality is fundamentally a biological instinct before it ever becomes a philosophical consideration. I would even go so far as to say the only reason rationality and philosophy are involved in morality is because that too is a part of human nature. We naturally appeal to reason when warranting a decision we might have to answer, well, to ourselves or to others for. And we rationalize even when we are not being honest about why we really make our decisions. It might be true that we are never more guilty of lying to ourselves and others than when we are appealing to reason to justify our behavior. The human moral apparatus is a function of the human brain instinctively based on biopsychological categories hardwired into human brains, which is why I have decided to refer to it as our moral apparatus. These emotionally embraced categories are involuntary. They are innate, and they operate on basically 5 hardwired cognitive axes. There may be more, but at least 5 have been given significant study. Don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that the specific morals you adopt are hardwired. They're not. What is hardwired is that as a human being, you will inevitably develop some sort of moral perspective based on how you come to organize these hardwired categories as you respond to the context of life's ongoing conundrums. Morality does not begin with philosophical questions. Rather, morality emerges because of biological and psychological needs and drives to balance personally puzzling and socially compelling concerns. We only become optimally moral when those needs are satisfied through the nurture of a well-balanced, healthy development. So once again, I say, morality is inevitably precipitated by human nature. The philosophical questions and answers emerge only as we attempt to deal with the questions unavoidably brought about by perceived conflicts between our various hardwired needs and drives as we navigate the challenges of life. I would liken my notion of our moral apparatus to one of the ways Noam Chomsky, the father of modern linguistics, has described the development of human linguistic capability. Chomsky notes, when a human baby and a kitten are born into the same household on the same day, we all realize that in a few years, banning some problem, the human child will be speaking the human language they have been exposed to, but the cat will not. And this is because their DNA is different. A human child is born with specific areas of their brain already hardwired to acquire and use language. We also know, unfortunately, due to disease and accidents, that very specific areas of the brain, if damaged, result in respective specific language problems based on the area of the brain so affected. Human beings acquire language not because they finally get around to deciding, hey, that would be an interesting thing to do. It's not as if when children observe others talking, they decide to jump off that same bridge. Humans acquire and use language because areas of their brain contain specific algorithms and heuristics that cause language acquisition and usage to be absolutely inevitable. Linguistic capability is simply built into human nature. But it is important to not overstate the implications. We are not hardwired to speak a particular language. Rather, we are hardwired to be human. So we adopt the cultural communication regularities already in place within the human environment of our childhood development. I would argue that moral behavior is very similar. It is simply a part of human nature and cannot be avoided or resisted voluntarily. All human beings, well, except those whose disorders have impeded their development, will observe and go about organizing moral questions along very specific instinctive axes. And, barring any problematic anomalies, they will form a conscience based on how their social and personal experiences organize their hardwired involuntary moral dilemmas as their brains go through the natural developmental stages. I might add that given the struggle to survive and develop, the organization of one's moral apparatus can lead to a wide variety of compromises in the inevitable conundrums brought about in personal experiences, thus creating somewhat different moral codes in different people. Human beings as individuals do not adopt the exact same moral codes, just as all healthy human beings do not speak the same language, even though they are similarly hardwired to acquire linguistic abilities and behaviors. So too, all human beings develop their moral codes by organizing the exact same set of moral axes dictated by their human nature. Keep in mind that brain damage, abuse, and trauma can derail moral development. Maslow's hierarchy of needs also, when not met, can jade a person's otherwise natural tendencies towards optimal moral development. The hardwired categories, or foundational axes, of what I call the human apparatus have been nicely outlined in the book The Righteous Mind by psychologist Jonathan Haidt. Let me unpack his list. The first axis mentioned by Jonathan Haidt is care versus harm. Haidt explains this foundation exists because the evolution of mammals created hormones that biologically induce within them social attachment systems. As human beings, we naturally possess the capacity, in varying degrees, to be aware of and to subsequently be concerned about the pain and pleasure we observe in others' experiences. This attachment system also promotes kindness, gentleness, and nurturing behaviors. And these behaviors, naturally driven by hormones in healthy subjects, guide rational thoughts in an effort to manage life's conundrums. On the other hand, perceived abuse or brain damage can precipitate carelessness and brutality. I personally would add that it is not as if harm is always perceived as wrong, nor care always perceived as proper. Built into our human nature is also an opposing healthy motivation to provide for ourselves responsibly, and an expectation that others adopt personal responsibility, and that we have a self-preservation need warranting certain forms of fighting or fleeing. Another axis mentioned by Jonathan Haidt is fairness versus cheating. This foundation promotes reciprocal altruism and, in turn, generates notions of justice, notions of rights, and a degree of autonomy. As the theory goes, humans evolved to be naturally concerned with such themes, but it is the experience and the influence of significant others that gives shape to how we specifically answer such questions. And sad to say, the people who perceive their survival as truly threatened by the world around them will, to a degree, prefer cheating to fairness. Fairness can be perceived as potentially threatening our survival or comfort. And so we set limits on what constitutes the demand for fairness, and those who exceed the limits are perceived as cheating. A third axis discussed by Jonathan Haidt is loyalty versus betrayal. This foundation helped humans survive as tribal beings, and it motivates us to form flexible coalitions. This, in turn, tends to induce things like patriotism, self-sacrifice for the good of the group, as well as shunning and oppressing those in the outgroup. To this, I would add that we all have a need to balance the need for loyalty with the need to go our own way. Individuality can be confused with betrayal, and a fear of abandonment can create an unhealthy loyalty. And so, no doubt, you can see how these conflicting human nature needs require some sort of moral code to resolve the conflict. A fourth categorical foundation considered by Jonathan Haidt is authority versus subversion. This foundation is observed in primates as they form hierarchical social structures. This causes human beings to entertain questions concerning leaders, followers, and cooperative roles, as we try to determine if, and if so, to what degree do we need authority figures? To what degree do we need cultural regularities and personal boundaries? We naturally conform to some cultural regularities in order to belong. We also go our own way against other regularities to establish a degree of individuality. I think this foundation could also be thought of as authority versus individuality. Here again, abuse can derail this natural tendency. We might lose respect for authority and become difficult people, or we might become passively submissive, accepting the manipulations of society, or becoming overly dependent upon certain abusive individuals. There is a balance everyone tries to find between submitting to authority and living to an authentic individuality. But also, in subversion, we have the need to find the balance between a just authority and an unjust authority. When pushed too far by authority, perceived as having gone too far, we can feel the need to rebel. Foundation 5, suggested by Jonathan Haidt, is sanctity versus degradation. All human beings have the involuntary psychological capacity for experiencing disgust, perceiving contamination, giving and receiving approval, and some valuing some version of purity. Studies of different cultures reveal a wide variety of differences in how this might get expressed. Some cultures adopt behaviors they think of as truly valuable, while another culture might find that exact same behavior repulsive. We humans deal with this foundational axis by devising strategies in order to rise above apparent counterproductive carnal concerns. The biological needs and drives of the body can come into conflict with our social needs. We might adopt the common notion that the body is a temple which can be desecrated by immoral activities or other contaminants. This, in my opinion, has also created various cultural norms that tend to denigrate or deny various manifestations of human nature, especially in the area of sexuality. I would argue that human beings are naturally and genuinely sensitive to these axes, and our sense of morality emerges as a byproduct of these sometimes conflicting and hard to balance biological drives and needs, while negotiated with the unavoidable conflicts of society. So, although I see morality as resting on the foundation of human nature, I do recognize that reason helps us come up with a way to justify how we balance the opposing concerns of our moral apparatus. It is important to realize these different foundational needs do not always work in harmony. Sometimes they are in opposition to each other, and sometimes simply appear to be opposed, thereby forcing us to struggle with how we might best prioritize, balance, or compromise our moral conundrums. And it is this process, after the fact of our natural needs and drives, that inevitably brings about the actual moral values we end up living by at any given moment in time. As I theorize it, the moral apparatus in our DNA hardwires us with these behavior evaluating needs and a capacity to prioritize, balance, or compromise. But we are not hardwired with answers to the conundrums our moral apparatus provokes. Speaking of moral conundrums, one moral issue that helps us understand clearly just how much our moral apparatus creates moral conundrums is the issue of radical honesty. I remember back in 1977 when I was a night janitor at a research and development lab, I came across a motivational styled poster on the wall that said, "Honesty may be the best policy, but our policy also comes highly recommended." I thought to myself, now that is very honest. Make no mistake, our morals are not those we articulate. Our morals are those that we actually live by. And although we might laugh at the humor in such a poster, it is the ironic truth. I would contend that claiming we should be honest at all times might sound socially and politically correct. But most of us realize that honesty is not always the best course of action. We just find it difficult to articulate our argument about how the legitimate desire for honesty must still be balanced, prioritized, and compromised with other equally legitimate needs that honesty might threaten. If there's one thing we know about human behavior, it is that everybody lies. How odd that people who argue we should always be honest are hypocrites. We recognize the social problems created when our lies are exposed, and so we universally learn to sustain the dishonest illusion that, although other people might lie, we have integrity. How ironic that our moral apparatus places us in the very conflict that causes us to lie about honesty. Another amusing fact is that now that I have said this, you're not sure if I might ever lie to you. It is now as if that I have publicly admitted that radical honesty is morally unworkable. You now might be suspicious that this could mean I lie too often. Perhaps more often than you do. But if we can, let's just for this moment be honest about this issue of honesty. It is not at all difficult to see that sometimes we lie because we care about how the truth might harm someone. We also lie because we realize the truth could seduce some people at moments to cheat. We lie because we fear abandonment. If we seem disloyal when we are truly loyal, we will lie. We lie because we fear that authority figures might use the truth inappropriately to threaten our individuality or our freedom. We lie because we believe someone truly cannot handle the truth right now. And we lie because we fear that others might unfairly judge us as impure. Oh yes, and sometimes we lie because we are harming, cheating, abandoning, and evading justified consequences. Then again, sometimes we tell the truth in order to harm, cheat, abandon, or to foment biased consequences. And let's be honest about this. The reason you want others to be honest with you is not always based on your best intentions towards them. I would propose that our problem with honesty is actually a useful metric. The degree to which we can be radically honest with someone else without that honesty provoking an issue is the degree to which that relationship has become solid. Relationships characterized by mutual deep love, trust, and respect for each other appreciate and empathize with the moral dilemmas we all face, and do not feel insecure or threatened by the level of honesty you can now rise to. We have a natural desire to be honest, and well-adjusted people are uncomfortable lying. But it is a universal discovery that we need to exercise caution and care in determining just how much honesty we can risk. And we are much more at ease in relationships where we are truly free to risk a high level of confidential honesty. Here's another truth I find fascinating about the prioritizing, balancing, and compromising of our moral dilemmas. Based on his research, Jonathan Haidt theorizes that if you prioritize each foundational moral axis as having equal weight and become convinced that they do not actually stand in significant opposition, this will lean you in the direction of being more or less conservative. However, if you prioritize these foundations so that perceived conflicts arising between them can be resolved by simply determining that care versus harm and fairness versus cheating are far more important than the other axes, then you will lean in a direction of being more or less liberal. Now, I do not want to imply that all moral questions are political. However, our adopted moral heuristics will determine if there is a side of the aisle that we are most comfortable with. These two different strategies of the conservative and the liberal in the stresses of life tend to become for both strong, inflexible habits that are not easily changed. And it is also hard to be aware of just how rigid we can be within our preferred paradigm. I would go so far as to say that the liberal and the conservative mindsets live more so in the filter of their moral paradigm and not as much in touch with reality. This might strike you as strange, but I don't see either of these strategies as fully developed, nor anywhere near as successful as dogmatic liberals and dogmatic conservatives would have you believe. The rigid equal rate strategy of the conservative mind requires a degree of denial about the actual dilemmas between each axis, and this denial inevitably leads to various forms of unintended hypocrisy. On the other hand, the prioritization strategy of the liberal mind requires an arbitrary hierarchy that, when inflexible, also leads to other various forms of unintended hypocrisy. But these strategies don't just lead to unintended hypocrisy. They also lead to a blindness that is unable to see the hypocrisy precipitated within one's own inflexible strategy. This results in both sides thereby overstating the hypocrisy they see in those preferring the other strategy. So to the degree we are dogmatically liberal or conservative, we tend to judge anybody who doesn't think morally like we do as being, by definition, not just different, but morally wrong. And both paradigms can be taken to obtuse, irrational extremes. I think this book, The Righteous Mind, helps explain why liberals and conservatives rarely have productive conversations. They use two different strategies for managing human nature's inevitable moral questions. And although they clearly see that they do not share the same morals, they tend to be oblivious to the cause being that they have a different strategy for balancing the foundational conundrums of the human moral apparatus. And so, unfortunately, they tend to always see the other as far more immoral. Nonetheless, even if you are more or less apolitical, you have adopted ways of simplifying moral dilemmas. And truth is, all of us tend to be more rigid than is justifiable, and it creates for us a degree of hypocritical blindness. As I see it, this is not a question of if, but rather to what degree. We all run into snafus that reshape our moral development in productive and unproductive ways. While growing up, we all experience intended and unintended traumas and disappointments that impede our natural moral development. To be frank, Embracing a dogmatic moral rigidity is not just a way of managing our moral dilemmas, it is also a way of justifying our hypocrisy. Balancing, prioritizing, and compromising moral conundrums never transcends the benefit of an experimental approach. This is also why I would say that a productive conversation and a far more workable morality actually requires that we break away from a preferred strategy and recognize the greater complexity in finding a balance in the competing needs and drives, well, challenged by the moral questions. And it would help us immensely if we appreciated the strengths and the weaknesses within our effort to honestly consider various strategies. Not that we can break free from having preferences, but we do better when we appreciate how things resolve under paradigms different from our own. It is not psychologically or morally healthy to try to have no moral paradigm. We just need to be honest that whatever paradigm we live in, it has strengths and weaknesses. We as human beings are truly and innately concerned with morality, and since it is a part of human nature, we really have no way of being psychologically healthy without pursuing the healthy and full development of a sustainable moral backbone. People who are more prone to bad behavior, not just lacking character development, they're probably also struggling with developmental damage and may need a redemptive path to healing. In the desperation for survival, we live in a social context that is not always hospitable. We tend to radically oversimplify the process of moral prioritization and development, and consequently, we polarize into different camps, preferring different prematurely stabilized approaches. And I would say that it leaves all of us failing to become anywhere near as moral as we actually naturally aspire to be. We need to balance moral questions with more of an open mind and adopt an appreciation for even more advanced development of our complex morality. We need a morality that can see things from several vantage points, not just our own. I would argue we need to see our liberal or conservative preferences as being an early but naive stage of moral development, seeking overly easy, reductionist answers to truly tough questions and leaving us a long way off from a more balanced and mature moral potential. We've become stuck in a rut in spite of our potential to rise above current heights. We outgrow the playfulness of childhood, but not its foolishness. As we get stuck in an inflexible strategy, there's one moral axis that can actually demotivate us from moving forward. It is loyalty versus betrayal. This axis, when out of balance, seduces us into an inordinate level of loyalty to our in-groups. We have a genuine need to belong to various in-groups, but when that need is threatened, we might choose to betray our need for autonomy to such a degree that it actually harms both us as individuals and the group. In a mob mentality, we prefer group loyalty in our personal life, and in our national life, we prefer war to respectful cultural diversity. The effort to rise above the current rut is not without potential backlash. When you start to humanize those in a group you disagree with, you must also prepare to be dehumanized by the group you actually agree with most. And God forbid you ever admit there could be shortcomings in your views or those of your cohorts. If you're open to considering complaints aimed at your in-group, at your in-group members or leaders, my goodness, that is often an unpardonable sin. All social sectors have problems and occasional bad behavior among their leaders and the rank and file. We should never fully abandon tribalism. We need tribes. That too is inescapable human nature, but tribes cannot mature and grow up when they forbid individuality or dissension with tribal members or diplomacy with other tribes. I remember in 1965 hearing Jackie DeShannon singing, What the world needs now is love, sweet love. That's the only thing that there's just too little of. I love that song. And even back then, I became aware of the fact that this has been a common theme throughout history. But if love is something the world seems to have always needed more of, then why is it we don't have it? As I understand it, morality, as it matures, is the expression of the vital love human nature deeply needs. But when we get stuck in an underdeveloped moral paradigm, we end up creating a world that continues to not have the love it profoundly needs. I have no way of knowing if this is entirely due to evolution or if there might be some sort of divine reality in our human design. Either way, until this world is no longer lacking the vital love it really needs, the human race has not yet reached the moral potential latent within us all. I truly believe we have the potential to be far more loving than what we currently have in the moral oversimplification in which the bulk of the human race has settled. We inadvertently betray our human nature and our fellow travelers when we get stuck in any stage of our moral development. Love. Love is the path. Thanks for listening. I'm Bob Greaves.